My name is Zoe. I make a lot of mistakes and I read a lot. And this video is about my reading wrap up for 2023 and my favorite books that I read in 2023. I read a lot of books. I have access to a lot of books. I see books daily coming in and out of the bookstore that I work at, and I own a lot of books. I try to pare it down a lot very frequently, but I am just exposed to a lot of books, and so obviously that makes me want to read a lot. And when you have access to a lot of books for free or advanced copies, it just like feeds that monster even more. So yeah, this past year, 2023, I read 152 books. I would not recommend doing that. I didn't mean to do that, but it is what happened. And in fact, I meant to read fewer books this past year. One of my intentions for reading in 2023 was to read fewer books than in previous years, and that is not what happened. I was, I think, disappointed with my reading this year. I had a lot of aggressively mid books. My average rating on Storygraph for the year of 2023 was 3.8 stars, which I think seems high. Like, I had books that I rated 5 stars this year that definitely are not going to be featured in this video, that I probably read the book very quickly in a couple days, or sometimes just a day, and then I loved it. I was consumed by it, and I rated it 5 stars, and then I put it on my shelf, or I lent it to a friend, or I gave my copy away, and then I did not think about it until I sat down to look at my reading throughout the year for this video. So I don't know, that rating is something that I think I need to review the way that I rate books. I was talking to my friend Mizuki today, and definitely, like, your reading habits change and the books you seek out change over the years, but also the way you interact with the books you seek out changes. That is not a revolutionary or very interesting thing to say, but it's just something I've been thinking about. Storygraph told me that my reading this year was 85% fiction and 15% nonfiction. That seems correct to me. I've definitely always been more of a fiction reader, although I find that when I do read nonfiction, it stays with me sometimes for a lot longer than fiction books do. And I really want to, in the coming year in 2024, prioritize nonfiction reading and make sure I'm really interspersing my fiction reads with nonfiction, because it makes me feel smarter and it makes me think about the world differently and interact with the world differently and interact with the people I come in contact with in a different way. And I think that that's how I want to read going forward. Also, I own a lot of nonfiction that sometimes I will buy a book, like we all do, and then it sits on the shelf for months or years, and then you pick it up and you're like, oh yeah, I really did want to read this, and then you read it and it like alters your brain chemistry a little bit. And that's what I want from my reading. So prioritizing nonfiction in 2024. So let's get to the books. I'm going to talk about these books in the order that I read them in this year, so from January to December. I don't know if I have a book for every month this year, but there are quite a few of them, so I'm going to try and keep moving, but not guaranteeing anything. The first book is The Late Americans by Brandon Taylor. I love Brandon Taylor. He's one of my favorite authors of all time. He's written 3 books. I think every single one of those books is phenomenal. I don't know that this would be the book I would recommend to start with. I do think Real Life should probably be the book you start with, and that's it was his debut novel. But The Late Americans is like just standard Brandon Taylor. It's gay, it's set in the Midwest of America, in a university town in Iowa. I'm pretty sure it's just Iowa City, Iowa. Yep, Iowa City, Iowa. And yeah, I finished this book in January of 2023, and I still think about scenes in this book. There is a character who has a lot of scenes in a public pool, and then the end of her kind of sequence in the book, she's reflecting on these geese flying overhead, and I think about that passage constantly. And I think about the characters in this book so often. I think Taylor is a very well-rounded author. He gets setting right, he gets tone right, he gets character right, and those things all combine to make my reading experiences of his books unforgettable, and this was no different. No different for me. I loved this book. Definitely a 5-star read for me. The next book is Any Other City by Hazel Plante, who is another one of my favorite authors. She has written 2 books. The other one is Little Blue Encyclopedia for Vivian, and I love that book, and I love this book. And I think Little Blue Encyclopedia is a much sadder book. This book is a lot more hopeful, and it's just so beautiful. Plante has this way of creating fake worlds. This book is a fictional memoir of a fictional musician who moves to a fictional city that is just in Europe generally, and it's this musician reflecting on her youth being in this city. She was, I think, like 19, very young adult, and she went to this European city, and she was very insecure in herself. She didn't understand her identity, her gender identity, her, like, what she wanted to do in life. She was kind of dealing also with a breakup, very, like, toxic relationship, and then she goes back to the city as an adult, post-transition, and after finding some success as a musician. And it's just it's a stunningly well-written, beautifully written book. There's so much empathy in this book for the main character and for the other people she encounters, and it's also so sexy. There is a sex scene in this book that I started reading at work, and I was like, I am going to spontaneously combust. It's so sexy, it's so just full of life, and I don't know if I read a lot of books that are full of life, and this book just stuck in my brain. It was one of my most anticipated books of 2023, and it definitely lived up to and also just surpassed my expectations. So if you're looking for a soft, sweet, sexy, beautiful book, I really would encourage you to pick this up. It's just absolutely gorgeous. The next books I'm going to talk about are the first 2 books of a series, but I just thought I would shove them together there because it's easier. And it's Poppy War and the Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. I have nothing to say about these books that hasn't already been said. I'm not a huge fantasy reader anymore. I definitely was as a child, and as a teenager I was hugely into fantasy reads. I just don't find I connect as much with them anymore. I know there's so much interesting and fascinating, which are the same word, very compelling fantasy series out there these days, and I think that's wonderful, but I just don't always find that I gravitate towards it. But these 2 books, I have been told by friends and coworkers to read them, and patrons to read them for literal years, and I finally picked them both up. I saw R.F. Kuang in conversation with another author in Vancouver back in May, and I read Yellowface before that because the author event was about Yellowface, which I also enjoyed. And then after I read Yellowface and I saw Kuang speak, I was like, wow, I think maybe I finally need to pick up Poppy War. So I read it in a very few days, and I was absolutely distraught and torn apart and just torn inside out by this book. Everything everyone has ever told you about this book is true. It's so fantastic. It's so cruel. It's so it's all encompassing, and I cannot believe that Kuang was 18 when she drafted this. That is just bananas to me. What a talent. What talent, what care, what passion. Just unbelievable. And then I picked up Dragon Republic the next day, same thing, read it in a couple days, and was just absolutely torn apart. Again, just, tore those pieces up again, stomped on them, crushed them up, made them into confetti. So I have not read the final book. What is it? Burning God. I have it over there. Burning God I have not read yet, and I will read in the coming few months this year. I just really needed a break. I read these in May, and I needed to get over the absolute devastation that these wreaked upon me. But it's absolutely, hands down, some of the best books I read this year, and those characters and those scenes just, they live in my brain now. So congratulations, RF, you did it. Next book is Some of My Best Friends, Essays on Lip Service by Taya Eisen. This is a collection of essays. It's like a memoir and essays by a author. She is Canadian. She used to be a voice actor as a child. If you've ever seen the show Berenstain Bears, she voiced Sister Bear on that show. So very integral to a lot of our childhoods. And Eisen also was a law student in Toronto. She grew up around Toronto, lived in Toronto. I believe she now lives in New York. But this collection of essays was an arc that I read. It actually came out in 2022, but it just sat on my shelf, as a lot of arcs do, and I neglected it for over a year. And when I finally got around to reading it this April, I was really blown away by Eisen's very biting, kind of like poker-ish humor. By poker, I mean like a poker that you'd poke like a fire with, or like a bear. That's kind of how I imagine her writing. She is very, very clever, so funny, like wickedly funny. The review that I wrote for this book was very short, and it was just, these essays rearranged the furniture of my brain, and I don't feel like I live in the same headspace anymore after reading this. And I don't know if I can give a better rundown of this book. I bought this book for a friend of mine. That's how you can tell that I really loved the book, because I purchased it for someone else. She has an essay in here on Canadian nationalism and how Canadians think that we have like it's like light nationalism, like Miller Lite, it's like nationalism light. But truly, the cultural identity that we think that we have is just as toxic, if not more so, than American nationalism. We think that we live in this very benevolent mosaic of cultures, and that's simply not true. And we all love hockey, and we all love beer and a good time, but that's also not true. And that is not what Canada is built on. It's built on colonialism. It's built on displacing and murdering Indigenous people, and then just not caring about the people who came to this country to find a home unless they're white. That is what this country is really built on. But she phrases it so much smarter than I possibly can. And that's why I think that everyone who is Canadian, and especially is a young Canadian like me, needs to read this book. But also, you're going to read this book and you're going to enjoy it. You're going to enjoy it because it's friggin' funny and it's so smart. And I just don't have anything smart to say about it. But the good thing about this book is right now it's out in hardcover, but it is coming out in paperback this year in 2024. I am not a fan of hardcovers. Paperbacks are a much superior technology. And I just want more people to have access to this book because it's very, very good. I think about it all the time. Go read it. The next book I'm going to talk about, I also do not have a copy of. I borrowed Mizuki's copy. Thank you, Mizuki, for lending it to me. I also borrowed this tripod ring light thing from Mizuki and Tanis. The two of them run a book club in Kelowna. If you're in Kelowna, you should definitely go. They're way more fun than I am. They're very funny, very enjoyable people. They have great taste in books. You should follow them at Same Page Book Club or at Tanis's Booked or Mizuki Reads. They're just really, really wonderful people. So Mizuki, thank you for lending me the book I'm going to talk about. Happy Hour by Marlo Granados. I'm sure you've seen this book floating around the internet. The girlies love it. The Flying Books cover is eye-catching, and then I don't know who published the American version, but that cover is also very beautiful. And Marlowe is an internet girly. She knows what the girls want. She gives it to them. I don't know what else to say. I loved that book. It was 5 stars for me for sure. I read it in like 2 days, sitting outside, eating popsicles, enjoying the summer sunshine, and boiling myself alive, which is how you should read that book. It's so funny. Again, Granados is a very humorous writer, and it's so joyous. And Granados has this way of capturing the beauty and the complexity and the joy of girlhood without leaning into vanity or frivolity. She really honors the experience of being a young woman who understands how freeing it is to not care and to just live the life that you want to live. I really, really loved that book. I think it's definitely a vibes over plot book, but it serves the purposes of the story. I don't know, I just loved it. It makes me smile to think about it. Granados did a episode on the Weird Era podcast. I think Sruti interviewed her, and their back and forth is really fun to listen to. So I really recommend that podcast, even if you actually should probably read the book first. Read the book first and then go listen to the podcast. It was really fun. The next book is A Secret Girl to Love by Casey Plett. These are short stories. My copy is signed, which is really cool. Casey is so kind and so sweet. I got to talk to her this year, and what a nice person, and so smart. You watch her speak and you're just like, wow, crazy. This is actually a reissue. A Safe Girl to Love was originally published about 10 years ago by a different press, and I'm not gonna remember, but this is Arsenal reissuing it, and I really like this cover. I think it's very pretty. It's a girl lying on her side, and you see her back there. These are short stories about trans women navigating life and love and loss and all those things. And yes, it was written over 10 years ago, but it feels like it was written now. I think that's a real talent to do, and maybe you think 10 years isn't that long, but it is. And I loved these stories. I apparently am a short story girly. This is something I found out this year, that people also think I'm a short story girly, and that's fine. I love short story. There are so many great short stories in the world. Some of the best ones I have ever read are in this collection. One of my top short stories of all time is in this collection. I never know what to say about short story collections though, because obviously there's a lot of journeys you go on when you read these different stories. So I don't know how to recommend this to you, but I think about almost all of these stories very regularly, weekly, if not more than that. And it's pretty, and it's a paperback, and it has good flop, even though this is water damage because I think I cried on it or I dropped it in the bathtub, or I don't know. I'm not very kind to my books. I don't know, just read it. Just read it. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Cross of Redemption by James Baldwin. This is a collection, uncollected, but this is a collection of speeches and book reviews and essays, profiles of some celebrities, letters. It's a bunch of stuff collected of James Baldwin that he wrote or said. Wow, good job, Zoe. It was very clear. But it took me a couple years to get through this. The font is quite small, and it's about 350 pages, which is really not that long. But I found that I had to really digest the words that I was reading here, especially the essays and speeches, which are all at the beginning of the book. This is also kind of embarrassing because this is my first James Baldwin book. It's definitely not going to be my last. I'm going to definitely read Giovanni's Room this year, and I want to read more of his books in the future as well. One of those writers that you read his words and you sit with them and you digest them, and they don't leave. They just stay in your stomach. They like sit there, not like a rock, just like a comforting weight, and they never leave you. They can't, because this is like the closest you will ever come to immortal language. It's shocking to read an essay or a speech or a book review for a book you've never read and probably never will read and think, this was just written, wasn't it? Because it's so true. It's so, I don't know how else to describe it. It's so true. His writing is so true. I don't know what else to say. This book changed me internally. My organs don't look the same anymore. I feel very lucky to have read it. Very lucky. There's a profile in here of Patterson, it's called The Fight, Patterson versus Liston. And it's these boxers in like Chicago. Floyd Patterson. Maybe if you know something about boxing, you know who that is. But Floyd Patterson fought Sonny Liston in the 60s. Some kind of boxing thing. I don't care about boxing, but I was crying reading that profile because James Baldwin can make anything applicable to anyone. That's insane. I don't know how you do that. This is an incredible book. The next book I'm going to talk about is Plantain by Zalika Reid-Benta. I also kind of want to give a shout out to another book, River Mama, also by Zalika Reid-Benta, that I also read this year and actually came out this year. It's a really, really engaging and very fun, delightful reading experience. It's set in Toronto. It's a love note letter to Toronto and to the Jamaican diaspora in Toronto. And if you're in a reading slump or you just want a super engaging, fast-paced book, you should pick it up. It's really, really fantastic and fun fiction writing. And it's also a gorgeous cover, and it's in paperback. And I bought it for a friend this year, so you know I loved it. But this book is what I really want to talk about, Plantain. I also have a signature in this one. This is like all of my signed books, guys. But I got to see Zalika Reid-Benta in conversation with a couple other authors earlier this year with my friend Colleen in Toronto. And she's very deliberate speaker, which I really appreciate because I'm not a deliberate speaker. I literally just word vomit like 24/7 and I can't stop myself. So I really appreciate intentional speakers. This is a novel told in snapshots of the main character, who is a young girl and then a young woman in Toronto. She's Jamaican Canadian. Her family is Jamaican and she was born in Canada, raised in Canada. And she is dealing with her family expectations, her mother's expectations, her grandparents' expectations, her community's expectations, her friends' expectations, and her own expectations of herself. She's kind of trying to create an identity while triangulating all of these expectations. Each chapter is a sample of her life at a different age. So at 8 years old, at 12 years old, at 15 years old, at 17 years old, these very intense and complicated ages that we all move through. It's just so, it's very, very moving to read, and it's a very tender book, but sometimes a stern one too, if that makes sense. You know how somebody you love can be so stern and so tender to you because they care about you. That is kind of what this book is like. And it's kind of claustrophobic too. You feel like you're in these ages with her. And she's a very quiet and thoughtful young girl and then young woman. And seeing her come into her own is so, just so tender. It makes me feel like gooey inside. just a book that like stays with me, and I know I will go back and reread this book and I will get more out of it. I just love this book. It's very, very lovely. The next book I'm going to talk about, I don't have my copy of it. I lent it out to a friend of mine, but it is Ledfeather by Stephen Graham Jones. And I know what you're thinking. Zoe, Stephen Graham Jones writes horror and you're a scaredy cat. And you would be right on both those counts. But this is actually a backlist title from Graham Jones. It's from 2008. And it is not a horror book. It is just fiction. And I came across it at Iron Dog Books in East Van, and I thought it was shelved in the wrong section, but they were right and I was wrong. And I'm so glad I picked it up. I read the first page in the store and I was like, I need to take this home. It's coming home with me. It's coming home to live. And I read it over the course of one day. It's pretty short and it's so gripping. The first like maybe 30% of the book, you don't really know what you're reading, what you're getting into. By the time you realize what's going on in the book, you are so deep into it that it's going to physically hurt you to put the book down. And so essentially it's sort of two timelines crossing. One is of an Indian agent in the late 1800s on the Blackfoot Nation in the US. Stephen Graham Jones is a member of the Blackfoot Nation, that's his heritage. And Indian agents were people who served the state, and they were basically sent to make colonialism smoother for the state. They were sent to indigenous peoples in the US to displace them, to make them dependent on the United States, and the decisions that these individual men made have had extremely lasting and destructive effects on generations and generations of indigenous peoples. And that is what this book is about. You see letters that this Indian agent wrote to his wife and the way he interacts with the Blackfoot people and the decisions that he makes. And you also, in the contemporary timeline, which I have to assume is the early 2000s, that part of the book is centered around a young Blackfoot man. And you see him from the perspectives of all the people around him, from people who love him, from people who hate him as only other young people can hate young people, and also from the point of view of people who don't know him. And these two stories tangle and intersect, and I don't really want to tell you anything else about it. This is one of the best novels I've ever read in my life. Most well written. The way everything pieces together and comes together in the end, and even in the middle, is so stunning to read. You can tell Stephen Graham Jones is a born storyteller and also someone who has had to work at his craft and who has worked at his craft. I can't recommend this book enough. The cover is not really giving, but the interior is. Just go with it. It's so good. It's so good. The next book I'm going to talk about is Some People Need Killing by Patricia Evengelista. This is a nonfiction book. I picked it up on a whim. It's an arc we had, and I thought the title sounded compelling. And I sat down one day and I thought, oh, I'll just skim it. I'll start reading the first few chapters, and I read the entire book in one evening. It reads like true crime because it is true crime. This is essentially about the drug killings that started during Rodrigo Duterte's presidency and have continued up to present day. I don't know a lot about Filipino history or the contemporary reality in the Philippines. I'm lucky enough to know and love some really wonderful Filipino people. This is a feat of journalism. Patricia Evengelista is Filipino. She has covered the drug killings in the Philippines from the start. She used to be a journalist at Rattler, which is owned and operated by actually all female journalists in the Philippines, and so she's got a journalist background, so that's where she is coming at this story from, is reporting. And she says in the book she tried not to insert herself into the narrative, and she found that to be impossible because the people being murdered were her people, are her people. If you are like me and all these words I'm saying to you are unfamiliar and you're like, Zoe, what are you talking about? Drug killings. I really, really think you should read this book. It's one thing to objectively say, as a white person, that I understand colonialism, because I don't. I don't understand it, and I will never understand it the way that colonized peoples understand it. But I think that reading books like this makes me come closer to understanding, to actually having real understanding of what colonialism does and how it scars millions and billions of people and what generational trauma really is. I think that a good book is a book that stretches your understanding and stretches your capacity for empathy, and this book did that for me, and I just really would recommend it. I think if you are Filipino, really have care with yourself reading this, because it's very hard to read at times. But if you're not Filipino, take the time, make the effort. It's a very, very affecting book. This last book that I'm going to talk about is Reuniting with Strangers by Jennilee, Austria-Bonifacio. This book was recommended to me by my friend Danny, who I have now known for a couple years, which is crazy. It feels like literally just yesterday. Danny is a bookseller in Vancouver, and I worked with her once upon a time, and just is a delightful human being. I feel so lucky to call her my friend and to have had my path cross with hers. And every time Danny recommends me a book, it just ends up being impeccable. So no surprise that this was no exception. I buddy read this with our other friend Colleen, who is Books the House Down on YouTube here and on Instagram, and we both love this book. So this is sort of a novel in stories, and it centers Filipinos and Filipino Canadian people and communities, and it deals with reuniting Filipino families after sometimes years and years of not being in community with these people physically. If you didn't know, a lot of Filipinos and Filipinas leave their country and go to other countries like Canada, like the US, like Saudi Arabia, like Hong Kong, Singapore, China, and they go work as foreign workers, often care workers, and send their wages back to their families in the Philippines. This is very, very common in that country, and countries like Canada benefit immensely from the work of Filipinos and Filipinas who leave behind their own families to come and care for our families. Austria-Bonifacio is Filipino Canadian herself, and she has done a lot of community work with Filipino Canadians, and you can tell how much that work means to her because it comes through in this book so clearly. The characters in this book are real people. That is what they feel like. This book gave me a window into a community that I do not belong to, but a community that I care about, and that includes people that I love. And I think that makes it a good book. It doesn't make it a great book. What makes it a great book is the beauty of the writing and the care of the writing and the way the care literally like drips from every page and makes you feel encompassed in that care, even when it doesn't belong to you. I think that every Canadian should read this. Not because you should, because you will get so much out of it. Like, it's a privilege to read, you know? It's a privilege for me to have been recommended this book by my friend, and then to have buddy read it with another friend, and now to talk about it. All that is a privilege. I feel very privileged. Wow, I like word repetition. I've clearly been sitting here talking to my phone for too long, but this is a really beautiful book. It was 5 stars for me. I read it very recently, just a week and a half ago, but I know that I will continue to think about these characters and these stories, and I look forward to revisiting it in the future because I know that I will, and I really think that you should too. Okay, so we're done. So that was a bunch of books, and I don't know how you guys do this. I don't know how you sit here and just talk. I think I talk a lot every day. So to sit here and then just talk at something, like an object, this is crazy. Anyways, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to me. And I would love to hear if you have opinions on any of these books, if they sound interesting to you, if you have books of 2023 that sit in your gut or in your liver or your kidney or any other organ. I want to hear about them because that's the kind of reading I want. I want books to shove into the crevices between my organs, my intestines, which is also an organ, and to sit in the gray matter of my brain and never leave. Okay, so we're gonna have less reading this year, fewer books. We don't need to do 150. We're going to have more nonfiction. We're going to have less mid books. I don't need those mid books. And we're going to have more organ reads, things that will live inside of me forever. And I hope that you have a great year of reading. Thanks for being here. I'll see you later. Goodbye.